It is a pleasure to be with you here, remotely at least, this evening. This is the second in our series of lockdown lectures. And I think we have a talk that I'm both looking forward to enormously, but I think that is also very timely. So I will start. That there will be, can you still hear me? I will start just by warning you that there will be a couple of audio clips that are played during our presentation that will start automatically when I advance to certain slides. So don't be surprised when you hear music coming out of your device. This theme, this talk tonight is very much about jazz and about music. Our artist, Bob Thompson, is an artist of the Beat generation who was absolutely obsessed with music and friends with many of the great musicians of the era. And so we will listen to a few clips, both for context and for flavor, to help us to understand the culture in which he was painting. When we go to museums, when I go to museums at any rate, I usually have a short checklist of works of art that I'm going to go see again. When I go to the Kummer, it's often a work of art that I'm currently writing about or that I'm doing research on. For instance, the painting of the Parable of the Marriage Feast on the left, which has interested me for some time. Sometimes it's a work that has a personal or special meaning for me. The painting on the right by William Glackens is one that I go back to every time I visit because it was my daughter's favorite. When she was a young girl, we would go stand in front of it and she would coo and make sounds of the colors. It's a beautiful, bright, colorful painting. One that I go back to frequently, that I often visit, is this painting by Bob Thompson, the artist who inspired our talk today. Thompson is an artist who vexes me, and this is a painting that really vexes me. It's such an interesting work to me for a number of reasons. First, the vivid brightness of the picture. It's intensely colorful in a tradition in the 20th century that touches on a number of movements, including Fauvism and Expressionism and abstract Expressionism. But for me, as a historian, the thing that has always really troubled me or vexed me is its dependence on one of the most famous paintings of the Renaissance. Bob Thompson based this work on the painting known as The Tempest by Giorgione. Giorgione, one of the most famous Italian Renaissance painters, a revolutionary, a figure who is in his own right one of the most important artists in Western art historical tradition. And Bob Thompson, an African-American painter in the 20th century, going back to the Italian Renaissance and drawing on this very enigmatic picture, has long interested me, long raised questions for me. In fact, the painting by Giorgione, The Tempest, is already one of the most enigmatic pictures that exists in the history of art. Just about every art historian who studies the Italian Renaissance has published something on it in an attempt to explain what it means. So what does it mean then when an artist 500 years later from an entirely different cultural tradition borrows this work and transforms it in this way? How does it alter the already ambiguous meaning of the original? So I've long been interested in that, and it drew me to an interest in Bob Thompson himself. The similarities between these two artists further drew me into the story that I'm going to tell you today. Giorgione is remembered as one of the great artists of the period, but he's also quite a mysterious figure himself. His name, Giorgione, is a name that we've given him affectionately. It means Big George, and we might as well call Bob Big Bob because, in fact, he's cut from the same cloth as Giorgione. Both of these artists were absolutely passionate individuals, at least according to Giorgione's biographers. They both lived short lives during which they accomplished extraordinary things. They died young. They were both obsessed with color. In fact, Giorgione is known as the first colorist of the Italian Renaissance. He's one of the very first painters to paint directly on a canvas without drawing first. And that dependence on color excited a lot of criticism from his contemporaries who suggested that he needed to learn to draw first. But for Giorgione, it was not about the drawing, it was about the color. And for him, color seems also to have been connected to music, which was his second love. But the same is true of Bob Thompson, just exactly the same thing. Bob Thompson, who came of age in the jazz age of the 50s and 60s. Let's see, we have some noise in the background. Emily, could we make sure that everyone is muted? And Bob Thompson, who came of age in the 50s and 60s during the jazz age, the beat era, was likewise obsessed with music. And for him, color was absolutely paramount in his artworks. He thought of it much of the same way we think of tone and timbre and color in music, as the unique voice that he gives to his works. So with these many comparisons and similarities between the two artists, I began looking into Bob Thompson's history. He's an absolutely fascinating figure. African-American man who came from a prosperous Black family, originally from Kentucky, that moved to New Jersey. His father was a prosperous dry cleaner, and the family has a very happy story until Bob Thompson reaches the age of 13, when his father died in a car accident. This happening at this critical juncture in the young Bob's life seems to have had a really traumatic effect on him and probably shaped the direction of the rest of his life. He seems to have been really unable to recover from his grief over his father's death for some years. His mother sent him to live with his adult sister in Louisville, and he spent his teenage years in Louisville and attended a segregated Black high school, Central High School in Louisville, where he first began to be interested in art and poetry and music. A very intellectual child. He earned a full ride to Boston University when he graduated from high school to study medicine, and flamed out after 5 months, came home and enrolled at the University of Louisville, where he began to study art. Much to his mother's chagrin, she was hoping urgently for a doctor. Bob had a series of teachers at Louisville who inspired him, and really, I think even without their assistance, he would have caught fire. But he studied with a series of artists who were in touch with what was happening in the world at large. 1956, 57, when he enrolls at the University of Louisville, the world is in the midst of the height of the abstract expressionist era. This is Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning, abstract colors and shapes and forms, highly gestural painting and action painting with no subject matter, or an art form in which the subject is the color and the form and the line and the shape. Ulfert Wilke, who was a German emigre who came to the United States after World War II and taught at the University of Louisville, was one of his first teachers. Likewise, young Bob was deeply inspired by an artist named John Frank, today very little known, but who had been one of Robert Motherwell's students and came to teach on a sabbatical replacement at the University of Louisville when Bob was in his first year there. It was John Frank, this artist who had studied with Motherwell, who convinced Bob that he should go to Provincetown, Massachusetts, which was the summer retreat of all of the abstract expressionists who mattered. It was the site of a number of summer art schools, including most famously the school of Hans Hofmann, who was the founding pioneer in many ways of abstract expressionism and a deeply influential figure to almost all of the artists of the era. This posed a number of complications. Bob was Black, and there was no way he could find a place to live in Provincetown. John Frank managed to help him find one of the very few property owners in the city of Provincetown who was African American, and Bob stayed with this elderly black man in Provincetown that summer, and went to school at the school of Xiong Moy, who was another abstract expressionist who ran a summer school in Provincetown. And this period deeply shaped him. 1958, he went in the summer. And essentially, he never went back. He dropped out of school and he moved to New York City. He was, in this first era, 1958, 1959, deeply influenced by the abstract expressionists. That summer, he painted a very Hoffman-esque painting called Provincetown, which shows how he is working out and thinking about the ideas that he was exposed to. But he caught fire that summer, and in particular, he was drawn to another artist, another fascinating figure who today is too little known. Jan Müller was a Jewish German artist who fled the Nazi oppression, was interned briefly in World War II before he made his escape, and came to the United States, still a young man, who had a very serious heart condition as a result of having rheumatic fever as a child. Jan Müller had an experimental heart surgery in the early 1950s. They replaced his aortic valve with one of the first mechanical pacemaker valve replacements. It was a plastic device that made an audible ticking noise and that provoked painful seizures from time to time. This traumatic experience, which led eventually to Jan Müller's early death in his mid-30s, just a few years later, was something that deeply shaped and changed the artist. Jan Müller is one of the first artists to return to the figure. Abstract expressionism, which was really the rule in that era artistically, had abolished the representation of human figures. Now, you may not think much of these little white and black organic shapes in the bottom of Jan Müller's picture, but these were heretical in the age of the abstract expressionists. Jan Müller had actually been Hans Hofmann's students, one of his prize students, but his return to the figure was something that led to a break between the two artists. Jan Müller became something of an insurgent, and he attracted a group of heretical artists who, like him, were drawn back to the human figure. Why was Müller drawn to the figure? And I think this is important because it's probably for the very much the same reasons that Bob Thompson was drawn to the figure in the age of abstract expressionism. Jan Müller's paintings revolve around themes of passion and mortality, of desire and death. His paintings, like the Bacchanal that we just looked at, are full of riotous color and full of energy and feeling, and desire is palpable. On the other hand, his cold paintings featuring Faust scenes, Faust is a recurring character, and Mephistopheles, these are obviously his own meditations on death. This is an artist who found that the abstract expressionist orthodoxy was not enough for him as an artist who lived with a ticking time bomb in his chest. We can see in this picture of Faust with the red mouse. The mouse itself is like this painterly evocation of the damaged heart within the chest, just waiting for the end. Müller died the year that Bob Thompson went to Provincetown. In fact, he died a few months before Bob Thompson arrived in Provincetown. But almost immediately, Thompson was drawn to Müller and to the people who followed him, to the people who also believed in a return to the representation of the figure. One of his first surviving works, in fact, is a painting that he made of the funeral of Jan Müller, an event which he himself did not attend, but which obviously he imagined attending. The painting is very much an homage to Müller, the blocky looking figures to the left, to the right in black silhouettes. Recall the blocky shapes that Müller began to introduce to his canvases in the 1950s. Within a year though, it's an extraordinary transformation, Thompson is radically transformed. He embraces the figure almost exclusively in his works for the rest of his life and career. And he introduces a profound colorist effect, these strong, saturated, pure colors, which recall Fauvist and early expressionist artworks. He is drawing in a work like this also on old master tradition. The forms and the shapes of the figures are adapted themselves from famous Renaissance and Baroque paintings, transformed by Mueller, by Bob Thompson, through his drawing and his color. This is a radical transformation. I can't tell you how significant it is. We, in some ways, have to go back to the 1950s and to understand in 1960 what it means to make pictures of the human form. This is something that was simply not really allowed in elite art circles at that moment in time. So Thompson is charting a new path, and it is in many ways revolutionary. He's drawing on traditions, of course. He is influenced by Fauvist art, that is art from the early 20th century in Europe that was incredibly playful with color, using highly saturated and unnatural colors, colors that are expressive rather than naturalistic, like André Derain's The Turning Road at L'Estaque, one of the famous early Fauvist masterpieces. Perhaps the most famous Fauve artist and the intellectual leader of the Fauves is Henri Matisse, his famous La Danse on the right. You can compare this to Bob Thompson's Cathedral with these intensely saturated colors and ambiguous spaces. Thompson's not coming out of nowhere. He's also interested in the tradition of expressionism, which his own teacher, Ulfric Wilcke, introduced him to. And in particular, Bob Thompson's landscapes are highly expressive. His skies and bodies of water and trees and landscape elements are in the same way that as we see in the screen here, gestural and expressive with loose and liquid elements of paint. It is ultimately, however, color that was really crucial to Thompson's concept of painting during this period. As he found his own voice, he discovered the intensity of color and the meaning of color for him. Here in The Triumph of Bacchus, a painting that is very much about passion, we might read against that a quote here on the left from a letter he wrote to his mother. In a twisted sort of way, he says, "I am doomed to be buried alive in cadmium orange, red, yellow light, and flowers on my grave of magenta violet. My casket being the canvas for forcefully having to walk and slide into it every day like the wan Prussian blue shore, and the shore, the tree, the leaf, the wind, the end." It's a poetic turn of phrase, no doubt, influenced by his interest in beat poetry. But the expression of color here, I think, in this quote is really fascinating to me. He finds here both joy and fear, I think, the quote reveals to us. The intensity, the passionate, the beauty of color, but also here he is conscious of the other side, of mortality and of death and of the exhaustion of the work, in part, that he set out to do. He worked tirelessly. He became, very soon after his arrival in New York, addicted to drugs and remained for the rest of his short life, living a kind of manic high in which he worked constantly, unbelievably productively. He produced over 1,000 significant canvases in the course of 7 or 8 years. But at the end of that period, exhausted, he died young, at the age of 28. When he hit New York in 1959, somehow, and this has to have much to do, I'm sure, with his personality, would have been a fascinating person to run into. He managed to meet every single person who matters in 1959 in New York and Greenwich Village. Here he is in the left-hand side of this photograph at Alan Capro's very first happening, arguably the very first happening anywhere. The idea of the happening now is a commonplace in our artistic culture. But Bob Thompson and his artist friend Jane Wilder here photographed participating in Alan Capro's first happening. Here he is at Slugs Jazz Club with the African-American poet A.B. Spellman. And here his portrait of Leroy Jones, later Amiri Baraka, one of the most important poet, commentator, author, activists of the 20th century. And here, Allen Ginsberg, the famous beat poet, and a portrait by Bob. Ginsberg writes of the first time that he met Bob Thompson, quote, in 1961 in Paris, saw him in the Left Bank Hotel studio. We talked and turned on. I dug his new candy bright colored style, making Poussin-esque space, flat colors, surface amorphism, delineating 3D figures. I thought him the most original visionary painter of his days, the first natural American psychedelic colorist. It was probably music and musicians, though, that had the deepest influence on Bob Thompson. He is pictured here with Ornette Coleman, the famous jazz composer and saxophonist, and an extraordinary figure in his own right, the center, Moondog. I don't know how many of you have ever run across Moondog, but he is one of those fixtures from 20th century New York, a street corner busker and poet who, to whom there's much more than meets the eye, a man who had a fascinating life and career in his own right. But here, united by their interest in music and percussion, these fellows were photographed together. Here, Bob and Carol Thompson, his future wife, with Jackie McLean, the saxophonist and composer at Slugs on New Year's Eve in 1963. I warned you there would be some music. This is Bob Thompson's The Garden of Music, one of his first major compositions. It's a monumental painting, 12 feet wide by 6 feet tall. It is a painting that represents, from left to right, Ornette Coleman, the trumpeter Don Cherry, John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, the bassist Charlie Hayden, Ed Blackwell on drums, seated. It is a painting that represents both Bob Thompson's friend circle and the people he admired. He was, at this moment in time, 1960, still developing this intensely colored style. You can see in this painting, the colors are somewhat more muted. He would hang out with his artist friends, his musician friends. He wanted to know, what did they see when they played? Did they see colors when they performed? He wanted to know what the mind of the musician artist perceived visually. And I think that plays out in our understanding of how Bob Thompson thought of color. Color for him, as I suggested, is something like timbre and tone and voice and the distinctive, unique character of a performer's sound. Color for him is the personality of the artist. From 1960, here an image of Bob in the studio, one of his few self-portraits, which you can see his drums in the background. He would hang out in his studio all day long with visitors. People would drop in, musicians and poets and his beat compatriots and girlfriends, and they would play music, they would jam, and he would paint, sometimes working on 3 or 4 paintings at once. He was seemingly indefatigable. Some people wondered if he ever slept, and undoubtedly this energy, this drive, this urgency to produce is one of the things that led to his exhaustion and his untimely death.
Baby, you understand me now. If sometimes you see that I'm mad, Don't you know no one alive can always be an angel? When everything goes wrong, you see some bad.
Perhaps one of the most important relationships that Bob formed with musicians was with Nina Simone, who became an extremely important muse and friend. In fact, just before he died, he spent another summer in Provincetown summering with Nina. And that is a voice, one of the most powerful voices of the 20th century, that gives us a sense of how he aspired as an artist with his own voice to find a unique form of expression. We see that on display here in one of the last paintings he made from 1965, his homage to Nina Simone. He was interested in color, as I say, and not necessarily in figure. Figure is important to his works, but he often said that he was as interested in the spaces between figures, the way that space holds in tension the values represented in the figures: man, woman, child, old, young. These are elements of identity which in this ecosystem of color and line and form obtain meanings that are different than we might think of in a story. In fact, I sometimes think that the figures in Bob's paintings are like the lyrics in a song. We can listen to them and they have meaning if we puzzle them out. But oftentimes we don't listen to the lyrics in a song, we hear them. That is, they wash over us with the voice of the singer, and we understand them at an expressive level, a level of color, a level of feeling, not necessarily a level of rationality. Bob's paintings are still in many ways in touch with the abstract expressionist tradition in his use of color, his use of liquid paint, and especially in his landscapes and above all his skies. We see Bob working on that sense of tone, of timbre and color. In fact, I like to say he has, in many of his paintings, Willem de Kooning skies, these intensely gestural, active, busy, colorful, riotous skies, which can go from candy colors to dark and stormy colors, are much like Willem de Kooning's highly liquid, gestural paintings from the abstract expressionist era. His life after 1959, when he was still an incredibly young man, just 20 years old when he arrived in New York City, just absolutely took off. He met everyone, and within a short period of time had become something of a star, a luminary. He got married in 1960 to Carol Penda. They took off on the QE2 for London in company of art historian and collector Stephen Pepper, funded by a Whitney Opportunity Grant. In Paris, they lived for a year where he painted at La Glacière, an artist colony and studio near Montparnasse, in the company of numerous other young hipster, beatnik, bohemian artists from Europe and America. Paris, 1962, with his wife, Carol Thompson. And then to Ibiza, which, what a wonderful place to be in 1962, I suppose. It's probably still a wonderful place to be, but good luck finding a hotel room. Ibiza in 1962, though, was a poor and isolated place, a wonderful island off the coast of Spain, where you could live very cheaply as a young man. And he and Carol went and set up shop in Ibiza, where they hosted an unending stream of young artists, of bohemians and travelers who came through. And at all hours of the night, they would wake up to greet their visitors as they arrived and feed them and shelter them. Bob held friends close, and they were extremely important to him. 1963, they returned to New York City, where he returned something of a conquering hero. He came back and immediately found gallery representation through his contacts and friends at several different galleries, at the Martha Jackson Gallery, a very influential gallery in the 60s in New York, which in many ways put him on the map, although you might also say he put them on the map. He broke records for visitation to the Martha Jackson galleries. And his works began to enter the major collections of museums and collectors around the country. All of this success, however, had a double-edged sword, was at a darker side. He was, as he became more and more successful, increasingly anxious about his success, increasingly anxious about the demands placed on him and the expectations that people held for him. He was already medicating with heroin and alcohol, and in 1965, his health began to seriously deteriorate. He and his wife returned to Italy, and in Rome, he had to have an emergency gallbladder surgery. This is one of the last works he made, 1966, a little drawing of the view from his hotel room or from his hospital room. And here, again, one of his last works, made in the hospital room, an image that is based on a medieval sculpture from the facade of Orvieto Cathedral, God taking one of Adam's ribs. There's this profound irony in taking this image of creation, God taking one of Adam's ribs to create Eve, to create the first human beings, and Bob Thompson taking this as a meditation on his own mortality, creation and death. His last painting is likewise a very suggestive one. Unfinished, we have just the sketch, just the outline of the figures. It's a depiction of the story of Venus and Adonis based on the great Renaissance artist Titian's work, Venus and Adonis. The story revolves around Venus' beloved, Adonis, the most beautiful young man alive, most handsome, and she is begging him not to go. He's going off hunting. She fears for him. It's dangerous. And of course he goes. He's gored by the boar that he's hunting, and he dies. Just as Adonis left Venus, so Bob left the world. As you can see from the works that we've just looked at, Bob Thompson was deeply interested in Renaissance and Old Master painting in a way that has really troubled lots of people, not just me. His contemporaries were interested in what he was doing because, in part, no one else was doing it. In fact, Old Master painting in the age of abstract expressionism was something that nobody was doing anything with. Bob is one of the first appropriators. This is a very postmodern thing in our society. From the 60s, we think of pop art and Andy Warhol and a whole line of artists down to the present day who use the visual materials of the past in creative ways. But no one was doing this when Bob started doing it in 1959, 1960. He is using these works in ways that troubled people for other reasons as well. Abstract expressionist critics, the critics of the day, they wanted to talk about nothing but form, color, line, shape. They didn't want to talk about content, and they really didn't know what to do with Bob Thompson's stories. They didn't know how to begin to approach the question of his use of narrative elements from the past. We see here in a few studies, Bob using photographs and printed materials as basis for his sketches. These are just sketches in a sense. They aren't like his own finished, completed works, but they're very telling in the sense of his interest in the past and the materials of the past. This is a fascinating, ironic work. It's a bifolio page from an art history textbook back in the 60s, full of those great white marbles of antiquity. You can all imagine them from your art history classes in college, the pale and colorless white marbles of the past. And here we see them recolored. Of course, ironically, all those white marbles were probably painted in Greek antiquity. And Bob Thompson, who has painted himself here into the scene, is giving them life and color again. Here he takes Michelangelo's drawing of the Fall of Phaeton and recolors it. The critics began to call this recoloring, but they didn't really have terms for appropriation at the time. They weren't sure what exactly Bob Thompson was doing. But it's something we are familiar with now. In fact, Thompson is a precedent for a number of artists who later on used appropriation extensively in their work, and including, in fact, he's doing it at the same time that Warhol is just beginning to think about exhibiting his own works. He is not following anything in the current of contemporary culture when he begins to make these experiments. But later on, in generations since, of course, we have lots of examples, including perhaps the most famous living artist in America today, Kehinde Wiley, who in a very similar fashion borrows and uses the compositions of the past to create new meanings in his own works. Or Titus Kaphar, a recent recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant, who appropriated the Kummer's own Portrait of a Youth in an Embroidered Vest as the basis for his painting Billy Lee Portrait in Tar in 2016. So what is Bob Thompson doing with these appropriations? It's a problem that is in many ways really quite difficult to explain, at least in the context of abstract expressionism. Certainly his reuses of things have meanings, very personal ones often. Here he's borrowing from the famous Piero della Francesca Urbino diptych, one of the most famous paintings in the history of the Renaissance. And he's borrowing specifically this triumphal allegory that celebrates the virtues of the portrait subject. Now, Bob, we have to imagine, is thinking of himself as the figure here in the center, flanked by birds, which were symbols for him of the soul and the spirit. For the Duke on the left, Federico da Montefeltro, it is his virtues of temperance and faith and fortitude which distinguish him as heroic. We can hardly imagine that temperance was one of Bob's virtues. And in fact, here, the column of fortitude is replaced in Bob's composition by a broken tree, which I at least interpret in relation to his own family history, the tree being a symbol of growth and of roots and of fruit and of familial destiny. Bob painted essentially two subjects. Bob Thompson's obsessions were with the passions of the heart and with the fears of our souls, in particular, with mortality. He painted bacchanals, riotous scenes of music and laughter and happiness, and he painted much more disturbing pictures. This is a picture that is based, in fact, on Nicolas Poussin's painting of autumn, an allegory based on a biblical subject, the spies bearing grapes from the promised land. They have this huge cluster of grapes. But in Bob's paintings of this subject, the cluster of grapes becomes disturbingly the corpse of a human being strung across this bar. I love this sky, by the way. This is a sensational example of that Willem de Kooning sky. Bob's paintings of mortality and of violence, the massacre of the innocents, frequently reflect on these very dark and disturbing themes of violence. In this case here, the crimson-colored attackers, the murderers of the children of Bethlehem, dashing the children against the ground, all carrying in one hand an example of the spirit bird that Bob depicted. Even the murderers have souls here. In another version of the same subject, the infants are no longer infants. They're adult children, their dark bodies strewn across the ground in a disturbing massacre, mourned by the women left behind.
7 trees, bearing strange fruit, blood on the leaves, and blood at the roots.
In some cases, it's all too easy to make a direct connection between the themes that Bob Thompson is painting and his current cultural context. This is a painting which he adapted from Fra Angelico's painting of the beheading of Saints Cosmas and Damian. But you can see that the black figure hanging from the tree, assaulted by the executioner in Fra Angelico's painting, is clearly, I think, a reference to the contemporary cultural context in 1961, to the trauma that the nation was experiencing in the course of integration, the early civil rights movement, and the violence against Blacks across the country. The very violence, of course, that Nina Simone was singing about in her song that we just heard. Many critics of Thompson were critical of his use of these old master pictures, which they felt he was simply copying, which is an argument I really think that breaks down when we run into a number of his pictures, which seem like they must be adaptations of historical works, but aren't. He made a series of paintings of the death of Camilla, an incredibly rare subject that it exists in extremely few representations in the Renaissance. This is a very good example of Bob inventing something in the Renaissance mode here, painting himself like an old master for a modern era. Camilla is an obscure figure from the Aeneid, a woman warrior, a heroine who's betrayed by a cowardly man who sneaks up behind her and kills her from behind, stabs her in the back. And although it's not an illustration of the text of the Aeneid, I think that we can read the text against this picture, which resonates with the themes in Thompson's work. Which leads us to The Tempest. And to my final thoughts here. This picture is such a wonderful picture, in part because Giorgioni's Tempest is such a wonderful picture. I remember when I was 19 years old and I traveled to Venice, backpacking through Europe, Eurailing all the way to Venice, really just to see this picture in the Accademia and the thrill that I felt when I saw it. As a reflection on what it means to go to museums, I think that experience is one that connects me to Bob Thompson, maybe connects all of us to Bob Thompson. If you've ever gone somewhere to see something wonderful from the past that gave meaning to our humanity, then you understand, I think, what Bob Thompson felt when he was at the Louvre, at the Prado, at the Accademia, where he spent so much of his time. It's hard to imagine how he got any painting done because his contemporaries said he was always at the museum. Bob Thompson's Tempest is totally different from Giorgioni's. It has some of the same values because, of course, it uses the same composition. The value of man, of woman, of water, of sky. But those are values that are held in tension in a completely different voice and a completely different sound than in Giorgioni's work. Giorgioni himself was an artist that troubled people. People didn't know what to do with his subjects either. In fact, this is one of the things that makes Bob and Giorgioni such interesting comparisons. Giorgioni was an artist who came of age in a time when subjects were incredibly important to the works of art. In fact, most artists made artworks at the behest of patrons who told them what to paint. Giorgioni, on the other hand, seems to have been making subjects which are not subjects at all. In fact, that is what one of my teachers, one of my great heroes in graduate school, the great historian Creighton Gilbert, called Giorgioni's works. He called them not subjects. In fact, coining the phrase which is widely used in art history today. It's not that they're not meaningful. There is still man, woman, child, water, sky, lightning, cloud. But there is no narrative that forms from these things. Instead, those meaningful values are held in the tension of our gaze and in the spaces between the figures, the spaces that Bob Thompson was interested in. Giorgioni was a fascinating character, as I have suggested here, a passionate and intense young man who died at a young age, also as a result, partly perhaps, of his passions. When the plague hit Venice, he couldn't stay home and went to see his girlfriend and died. Here we see in another work the kinds of things that probably appealed to Bob about the artist Giorgione: color and light, and a vexing lack of meaning, of clarity. We see values, time and music and color and sky, earth and light. But we don't arrive in a work like this at any particular meaning. We call this painting the hourglass simply because there is one in the work. Likewise, this image, which we know colloquially or collectively as tramonto, il tramonto, which means simply the sunset. There are so many hundreds of words, thousands of words spilled trying to decipher Giorgione's pictures. And I can say as an art historian, I don't think there's consensus around the interpretation of any one of these mysterious works, which are, like Bob Thompson's works, immediately available to us through their colors, through their values of form and space, through the accessibility of the recognizability of figure and of tree and of sky and of land. But we hold these values in our poetic imagination in a lyrical way, rather than being able to decipher them like a written text, like a book, like an instruction manual.
Ne me quitte pas, il faut oublier tout, s'oublier qui s'enfuit déjà, oublier le temps des malentendus et le temps perdu, à savoir comment oublier ces heures qui tuaient parfois.
Ne me quitte pas, don't leave me. A space between the man and the woman divided by the water, red and blue, the sky, its turbulence, color. I think this idea of separation and of alienation in our painting, painted by Bob Thompson near the end of his life, is a poetic place to end our talk today. What does it mean? It means something very beautiful, I think, especially when we see it or listen to it against a track like Nina Simone's. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. This was absolutely superb. You've given me a whole new perspective on Bob Thompson. I can't wait till the museum opens again and can come see it in person. This was a wonderful lecture. So thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have one question here, which is a very good question. I appreciate whoever asked this one. You have spelled his last name with and without a P. Which is it? It is with a P. And so thank you. I appreciate you catching my typos in the PowerPoint. That was quickly answered. I thank you very much, Diane, for your comments and your enthusiasm. I have to tell you, this is an artist who exemplifies the reason why I go to museums. An artist who I didn't know anything about before this painting entered the collection of the Kummer Museum in 2011. And then when it appeared on the wall for the first time, I remember seeing it and just thinking, God, what is going on here? What's happening here? And it bugged me. I returned to it and it bugged me every time I went back until I finally scratched that itch and began to look and to think deeply about it, which is what museums did for Bob Thompson, what I think museums, can do for all of us, especially at moments right now where things are bugging us and things demand our attention. They demand a response. They demand a thoughtful response. When the itch scratches, I think that's something powerful that works of art can do in our community here. Was any of his later work abstract? No, once he turns from abstraction in his very earliest career, he turns to the figure and he never leaves the figure. The figure is, I think for him, the seat of as it is, the human form is the seat of all passions and fears. This is the problem, I think, for a lot of people who reacted against abstract expressionism, is that it's one thing to say that we can see the gestures and read the movements of the artist, and the line itself is expressive of feeling and emotion. It is very alien to us. Human form is familiar, human form is intimate. And there's something about the figure itself as the seat of our passions and fears that makes it a form that we return to again and again. So where can you find Thompson's work? We are fortunate to have a Bob Thompson, because I can tell you the big boys have snapped up almost all of his works. MoMA, the Metropolitan, the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Chicago Institute, the MFA, his works are, the Whitney, his works are in the best collections in the world, and or at least in America. So I think that this is another example of this remarkable gem that we have here in the city of Jacksonville that both deserves to be better known, and it is also a sign of just how fortunate we are to have the resources that we have. I'll share another little meditation on museums briefly. I grew up in a town that had a museum, the Museum of Arts and Sciences in Macon, Georgia. And we had the skeleton of a prehistoric whale that was extracted from the clay mines outside of town that fueled our brick factories. We also had a petting zoo. There wasn't a whole lot of art, though, in the Museum of Arts and Sciences. And it was a revelation to me the first time I went to a real museum. I think my Uncle Bob dropped me off in LA at the Norton Simon in Pasadena, where I spent the next 4 hours wandering around completely lost until I ended up in a Gothic art gallery. And it's probably why I became a medieval art historian today. I don't know. We're incredibly fortunate to have the resource that we have here. It's something I didn't grow up with. I think it's something also that Bob Thompson didn't grow up with, that he discovered this passion and this intense urgency to understand. So someone asks, is there a comparison between Thompson's work and Gauguin's? And absolutely, the answer is absolutely. I think that among other artists, Bob Thompson is looking at Gauguin, he's looking at Van Gogh, he's looking at Matisse, he's looking at the early Fauve artists. He's very interested in these post-impressionist and Fauvist artists and their use of color and their use of paint. And I think that the flatness and the intensity of color in many of Gauguin's works is a wonderful point of comparison. Expressionism in almost all of these works, absolutely. So you can't talk about Bob Thompson without talking about his use of expressionism. In fact, to the extent that we have labels for him, which he really defines labels in a lot of ways, he's known as a figural expressionist, or a figurative expressionist. But I think if we look, for instance, at his treatment of sky, of water, of landscape, and I'll be frank, I think a lot of times I think of Bob Thompson as a landscape painter rather than a figure painter. His landscapes are tremendously expressionist, gestural, liquid paint, a very lively, a very active quality of line and of mark making. You can see, for instance, in the figures, the paint is much more opaque. And in other areas, especially in his skies and his landscape elements, he uses a varying opacity of paint in order to create marks in the surface of the paint. It's very brushy. There's this figural and gestural expression that is characteristic of expressionism. And he's absolutely comes out of an expressionist tradition, Fauvist tradition, an abstract expressionist tradition. If we were simply, for instance, to cut out the sky in our Tempest painting, I think you would look at it very much in relation to Willem de Kooning or to other artists of the pure abstract expressionist era. And have I shown most of his work? No, I have not. I have barely scratched the surface. In fact, I had to cut out a lot of paintings that I wanted to show you. A lot of his works are available online if you Google him. He is in major collections, and those institutions have done a good job of putting his work online in good reproductions. there's so many vivid, intense, powerful, beautiful works out there. I encourage you to go take a look. So as I said, in 6 years, 7 years, he produced over 1,000 major works. Many of these are huge, are monumental. The Cummers painting is not. It's a good size, but he produced huge works, small works. I also showed you the works on paper. Those are, I think, primarily works that he is working on, generating ideas, thinking things through, but there's hundreds of those as well, of those works on paper, watercolors and gouache paintings on paper. His wife was not an artist that I know of, although during this era, many of the beat artists, men and women, intermarried. He married her, Carol Penda. She was certainly a member of this larger beat community, and they fell in love and married. And she devoted, after his death, much of the rest of her life to Bob's legacy, and to the extent that that his work has found new success through major retrospectives. In 1999, there was a huge retrospective at the Whitney that produced a lot of attention. A lot of that is due to Carol Penda, who really was committed to making sure that Bob's voice didn't get lost. It's one of the tragic things about this particular artist, that we don't know what he would have become. Like so many artists, of course, and he was a young man, 27, 28 years old when he died. Like so many artists, we must have expected at some point an evolution, a transformation. Would he have continued to work in this historical mode? Would he have continued with the appropriations? What would have been the future for Bob Thompson? We don't know. And for him, his legacy has been really hard won, partly because, of course, he was so unique at the time. And he came and he left the world so quickly that I don't think the world had enough time to respond and to adapt and to understand what he was doing. So Bob risked being lost, I think, in the current of history, if it weren't for Carol Penda and many of his other friends in intellectuals in the Beat movement who were friends with him, who were also devoted to his memory. Do we have one final question, perhaps? I have enormously enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to the last in our series of talks. I think this was a perfect moment to talk about Bob Thompson and the question that his work raises about the past, both through his use of the past and through his position in our own past as a reminder of the vitality, the energy, the brilliance, and the importance of access for all people in our society. For a young African-American man growing up in segregated Kentucky and jousting with the old masters, his jazz reinventions are works that I think stand in their vibrancy alongside those that he was aspiring to challenge. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you all next time.